Some stories don't start with heroes. They begin with silence, a silence so thick it fills a small roadside diner where an old man, proud but weathered, is told he's not welcome, simply because he can't pay for a meal. No one speaks up, no one moves. But what the room doesn't realize is that the man they dismissed so easily once trained the very soldiers who defend their right to sit there in peace. 1 hour later, that silence is broken, not by revenge, but by a whir of rotor blades slicing through the Georgia sky. A son steps out of a helicopter, not in fury, but in purpose. And with one sentence, he reminds an entire town and a nation that dignity doesn't wear a name tag and honor doesn't demand recognition. It just quietly stands. This is the story of Franklin Ward, a veteran whose quiet strength taught us that true leadership isn't loud. It listens. And sometimes it changes everything. Get out if you can't pay, old man. We're not a shelter. The words hit like a whip crack in the cramped, clattering diner. The clatter of forks and soft chatter of morning routines evaporated into a stunned silence. Every head turned, eyes lingered. A heavy quiet took over. Raymond Ellis, 83 years old, stood frozen beside the counter. The server's voice still echoed in his ears, louder than it had been a moment ago. He hadn't expected kindness, but he hadn't anticipated humiliation either. His thin fingers reached down toward the worn canvas bag at his feet. When he lifted it, the bag tipped, spilling its contents across the scuffed linoleum. Coins, a photo, and medals. Military medals. The metal clinked and rang with small, accusing sounds, sharp and echoing in the stillness of the room. No one moved. Not a hand was offered. Not a word was spoken. Shame filled the air like smoke. With quiet dignity, Raymond bent, scooping each piece into his trembling hands. His fingers moved slowly, knuckles stiff from years and weather. He stood tall, what remained of tall, with all the strength he could gather. No apology, no explanation. He walked out without meeting anyone's gaze. Not a single word passed his lips. But that was not the end. Exactly 1 hour later, blades sliced through the air above the quiet Georgia street. A military helicopter, matte black, its insignia stark against the hull, descended into the diner's gravel parking lot. Dust flew, chairs toppled, dishes shook on their shelves. Then silence again as boots touched the ground. A high-ranking officer in full uniform stepped out, shoulders square, face unreadable. He entered the diner like a blade. One sentence. That was all it took. And just like that, the place was shut down. No one working there knew the man they had cast out, too old, too broke, too inconvenient, was the very one who had once led America's elite, who had taught discipline and honor to the men and women who now protected the nation. More than that, he was father to the man who had just landed. A few miles away, the American flag climbed slowly up a weathered pole, catching in the morning breeze that curled through the small Georgia town. The house beneath it was humble. Red brick, chipped paint, wilting flower beds that hadn't seen care in too long. But it was home. Franklin Ward stood outside, back straight, chest forward, hand over his heart. His frame had thinned, but not his resolve. He never said the pledge. He never needed to. Every sunrise, every scar, every step had already said it for him. You could see the years stitched into the corners of his eyes, in the way he stood like a man still on duty. Routine kept him rooted. Flag raised by dawn, black coffee by 6:15, no cream, no sugar. Then the familiar walk, deliberate, steady, cane in one hand, canvas bag in the other, past rusted fences and sunburnt sidewalks, toward the old church that had long ago become the town's veteran center. The place was humble. Roof leaked when it rained, and the fluorescent lights hummed louder than the men who gathered beneath them. But it was sacred, a place where soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines came, not for answers, but for each other. Franklin didn't talk much. He listened. That's what mattered. The younger veterans, the ones whose eyes darted and whose hands shook around cheap styrofoam cups, found something solid in him. They spoke about memories that wouldn't sleep, about futures they couldn't quite build. Franklin never flinched. He never judged. And when advice was asked for, he gave it short and clear. Most times, they didn't want answers. They just wanted someone who understood. He gave them that just by being there. Not with war stories, he didn't tell them, but with silence, stillness. He anchored the room so others could breathe. But this morning something was different. He didn't stop by the center, didn't give the usual nods to the regulars on the corner. His shirt was crisp, freshly pressed under the olive drab jacket that had seen decades. He checked his canvas bag 3 times before locking his front door. Today he was meeting his son, Colonel Nathan Ward, commander of U.S. Special Forces Operations. The title meant little to Franklin, not because it wasn't impressive, but because titles didn't matter to him. What mattered was the man Nathan had become, a steady presence in chaos, fiercely moral, unfailingly kind. Franklin had never once pushed his son toward the military, never uttered the words, "Follow my path." But Nathan had walked it anyway, carving his own way through the same grit and gravel. They hadn't seen each other in nearly 6 months. There had been the occasional call, always brief, usually muffled by static or interrupted by secure lines. And then, just yesterday, came the message. Nathan would be flying through Georgia, a single hour to spare. Franklin didn't waste a second. Franklin hadn't hesitated for a second when Nathan suggested they meet at a diner midway between the airfield and the highway, a quiet little place known more for its dependable coffee and honest pie than its decor. Nathan had offered to send a vehicle, one of the transport guys from the base. "We'll swing by and pick you up, Dad. One of the guys can, No need," Franklin cut in before Nathan could finish the offer. "I know the route. Took it plenty back in the day. Bus still runs it." Nathan had let out a soft laugh. "It does. You sure?" "I'm not dead yet." It was a joke, but one anchored in the weight of truth. Though if you asked his niece, she'd likely have a counter-argument ready, usually wrapped in worry and frustration. But Franklin didn't believe in being carted around like he was already halfway gone. He'd studied the bus schedule the night before like it was a military briefing, plotting 2 transfers with practiced precision. Just in case, he'd left a full 2 hours early. Pain flared through his joints before he even stepped onto that first worn-down Blue City bus. But he didn't complain. Payne had been walking beside him for years, like an old soldier who didn't speak much and never needed acknowledgement. Franklin sat by the window, back straight, posture drilled into his bones from a life lived with purpose. The Georgia landscape moved past slowly, like a slideshow of forgotten days. Tall pine trees, leaning fences, rusting out gas stations that hadn't seen a customer in years. His thoughts drifted, but never far. His mind remained tethered to what mattered most today. He'd brought something with him, a small wooden box worn smooth at the corners, hidden inside his canvas bag. No money inside, just memory. Meaning. Nathan's childhood photographs, a bronze star, a silver star, and a letter Franklin had once written to his son long ago, but never found the courage to mail. He wasn't sure if he'd hand it over today, but it had to be with him. Just in case. By the time he reached the transfer station, his fingers were stiff from gripping the seat during the ride. A teenager, barely more than a boy, had noticed and offered his seat without hesitation. Franklin had accepted with a nod, his voice steady and warm. "Thank you." The sincerity in those 2 words seemed to carry unexpected weight, because the young man straightened afterward, as if he'd been handed a responsibility. Franklin had always believed respect was the cheapest form of honor, yet somehow the hardest to find. When he finally stepped off at the small roadside diner, it was 12 minutes past noon. He checked his watch. 12:08, more than enough time. He moved carefully but with purpose, eyes scanning the place as he stepped inside. Wood-paneled walls held the stale scent of bacon and old conversation. The booths were time-worn, their vinyl patched and cracked from decades of elbows, spilled milkshakes, and after-school gossip. A dusty jukebox crouched in the corner like a relic of the Reagan years, likely broken but not yet discarded. Franklin smiled faintly. Nathan would probably get a kick out of this place. He found a corner booth and slid into it, lowering himself slowly and setting his canvas bag beside him like an old comrade sharing the mission. His knees screamed with every movement now, a throb that drilled straight through muscle and memory, but he didn't show it. Instead, he sat tall, quiet, and patient. Waiting. He'd barely been seated 5 minutes when a young man in a maroon apron swaggered over. Couldn't have been more than 20. Tall, skinny, spiked hair like he'd rolled out of a 90s punk magazine, and a smirk already baked into his face like it came standard. The name tag read Troy. Troy didn't offer a hello, didn't even glance up at first. He pulled out a faded notepad, clicked his pen twice like a nervous tick, and asked without inflection, "You ordering or just squatting?" Franklin lifted his gaze slowly, unbothered, measured. "Just a coffee for now," he said. "My son will be joining me shortly." Troy finally looked up, taking in the man sitting across from him, the olive jacket worn at the seams, the creased khakis, the bag beside him tucked like a soldier ready for orders. "Minimum order's $10, Troy said, deadpan. "This isn't a waiting room." Franklin nodded, expression calm. He reached for his wallet, slow and deliberate, as if the moment deserved the dignity of care. "Then I'll have a sandwich too," he said, voice steady. "That should cover it." His hand shook just slightly as he opened the weathered leather fold. Inside were a few crumpled bills, a couple coins, the remains of his monthly pension, most of which usually vanished into prescriptions and utility bills. He'd known it might be tight. But today wasn't about comfort. It was about being here on time with what mattered. "Son is Colonel Nathan Ward. I recognized him from the news a few months back. He was honored in D.C. You think I wouldn't remember a face like that?" "That was his dad. You just humiliated a war hero in front of everyone." Troy scoffed, not quite laughing now, but not backing down either. "So, doesn't mean he gets a free meal. This isn't a charity." Amy's jaw clenched. Her eyes glistened, but her voice didn't waver. "No, it's not a charity, but it's supposed to be a place where we treat people like human beings, not like garbage." Troy rolled his eyes again and turned back to the counter, muttering something under his breath. But Amy wasn't finished. She stormed past him, untied her apron with a sharp tug, and dropped it on the counter. She glanced out the window and saw Franklin, just about to turn the corner down the sidewalk. "Cover my shift," she said to no one in particular, already halfway to the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, and Franklin had paused to adjust the strap on his bag, the faded canvas now bulging slightly with its hurried packing. Amy jogged to catch up to him, heart racing, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she'd just witnessed. "Sir," she called softly. Franklin didn't turn right away. Maybe he hadn't heard. Maybe he thought she was calling someone else. But then slowly he glanced over his shoulder. His eyes were calm but tired, his stance still impossibly straight despite the limp he was trying not to show. Amy approached gently, not wanting to startle him. "I saw what happened back there. I'm so sorry." He offered a small, polite nod. "Nothing to be sorry for, miss. Wasn't your doing." "But it was wrong," she insisted, stepping closer. "The way he treated you, no one deserves that, especially not someone who's given so much." Franklin's expression didn't change much, but something flickered in his eyes, a recognition, a quiet gratitude. "Sometimes people forget," he said simply, "or they never knew." Amy hesitated, then held out a small paper bag. "I packed this up before I left. Coffee and pie, the warm kind." She smiled, eyes searching his. "It's on me. No strings." He looked at the bag for a long moment, then at her. "Thank you," he said quietly, taking it with a kind of reverence that made her throat tighten. They stood there for a beat, two strangers connected not by words but by a silent understanding. Then Franklin gave her a slight bow of the head and turned again to leave. He didn't walk faster. He didn't need to. Every step was a statement. Amy watched him go, her chest heavy, her thoughts racing. Inside the diner, everything had returned to normal, plates clinking, utensils scraping, laughter punctuating casual conversation. But Amy knew something had changed, for her at least. And maybe, just maybe, someone else had noticed too. He had the bearing of a man forged by war, trained to face chaos with cold precision. Yet now he moved with a different kind of purpose, one not taught in any military academy. Nathan Ward crossed the lot with long, determined strides, the rotor still spinning behind him like the heartbeat of a machine that had just delivered justice. Franklin didn't say a word. He simply stood there, his back straight, his boots planted firm on the cracked asphalt. When Nathan reached him, there was no need for a salute or handshake. The look they exchanged said more than words could carry, a glance that held years of quiet respect, of pride unspoken, of wounds neither had dared bring into the light. Inside the diner, Troy's jaw tensed as the door swung open. The bell above it jingled like it always did, but now the sound rang hollow against the silence that followed. Everyone had gone quiet. Amy was frozen in place, one hand resting on the edge of a booth, her eyes locked on the man who had just stepped inside. Colonel Ward didn't scan the room. He didn't have to. He walked straight up to the counter, his shoes clicking sharp against the tile. He stopped just short of Troy, who swallowed hard but didn't move. "My father was disrespected here," Nathan said, voice calm but laced with steel. "I'd like to know why." Troy blinked, he stammered. "Sir, he didn't order enough to sit. It's just policy." "Policy," Nathan echoed, letting the word hang in the air. "You have a policy that allows you to treat veterans like beggars?" Amy stepped forward, her voice soft but unwavering. "He didn't do anything wrong. I tried to—" Nathan held up a hand not to silence her, but to say he already knew. His eyes never left Troy's. "You humiliated a man who served this country with honor, who never asked for recognition or help or a handout. He just wanted a meal. And now you get to live with the memory of what you did when no one was watching." Troy said nothing. His face had gone pale. Nathan turned, walking back toward the door. "Let's go, Dad." Franklin followed, his steps steady, as if each one carried away the weight of the moment. As they passed Amy, he paused. "Thank you," he said gently, meeting her eyes, "for seeing me." She nodded, blinking back something unspoken. Then they were gone, the door closing behind them with a quiet finality. Outside, the wind had settled. The Black Hawk waited, still and imposing. As father and son approached, the crew saluted Nathan and helped Franklin aboard with care that was more reverent than routine. Inside the diner, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence had turned from awkward to heavy, like the place itself understood something had just changed. Amy looked back out the window. The helicopter lifted into the sky, slicing through the clouds as it rose, like a silent answer to everything left unsaid. He belonged here, nowhere else more than right here, right now. That certainty was etched into his posture as two military police officers stepped in behind him. Between them walked a woman in pressed uniform, crisp glasses perched on her nose, and a leather folder cradled in her arms. She moved with measured precision, calm, firm, a presence that demanded attention. She was the legal affairs officer for the base. Nathan's eyes swept across the lot and locked onto the one man who had always been there, steady as stone. His father, Franklin Ward. Just as he said he would be, he stood tall. No bitterness, no apology, no anger. Just that quiet, dependable strength Nathan had chased his entire life like a shadow he never quite caught. Franklin had never been one for drama. He was there, waiting. That was enough. They walked toward each other without words. They didn't need any. Their hands found each other's shoulders in a firm, unspoken bond. That simple gesture said everything. "You all right?" Nathan asked, voice low. "I'm fine," Franklin answered, eyes steady but laced with quiet shame. "Just embarrassed." Nathan's jaw tightened, his body stiffening just slightly. "That can be fixed." Turning toward the officers, Nathan gave a single nod. Without another word, he headed toward the diner doors. Inside, the clink of cutlery and low chatter came to a full stop once again. But this time it wasn't from mockery or rudeness. It was presence, undeniable, commanding. The door creaked open. Nathan entered first. Behind him came the two military police officers, then the legal officer who stepped forward and addressed the room. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It had the authority of a gavel. "We are here regarding an incident involving Mr. Franklin Ward, veteran decorated instructor and a protected individual under Title 38 of the United States Code." From the kitchen, Greg Harris, the diner's owner, appeared, drying his hands with a stained towel, face puzzled. "What's going on?" Nathan stepped forward now, composed, voice measured, but every word razor sharp with purpose. "That man you threw out?" He gestured toward the door. "He trained over 3,000 Special Forces operators. I was one of them. So were two members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. He served this nation longer than most people in this room have been alive. Troy, still standing near the TV station, looked stricken. I, I didn't know. He never said anything. You weren't supposed to know, Nathan cut in, his tone colder now. You were supposed to treat every person who walks through that door with dignity. Not because of their rank or medals or uniforms, because they're human. That's what matters. No one spoke, no clinking of plates, no whispers. The room was still, holding its collective breath. The legal officer stepped forward again, this time holding a sealed envelope. She handed it to Greg. This establishment is hereby placed under temporary suspension, pending a full investigation. Under both state and federal veteran protection statutes, in accordance with an executive order issued by the governor's office, you have 30 minutes to vacate. Greg's face turned red. This is outrageous. We didn't lay a hand on him. Nathan took one step closer, eyes unwavering. He fell because your employee yanked his arm and sent his things scattering across the floor. Right here, in front of everyone. Not one of you helped. You all just watched. Amy, quiet until now, emerged from behind the counter, her voice fragile. I tried to speak up. Nathan held up a hand gently, cutting her off, but not unkindly. I know you're not why we're here. Then he turned, surveying the room, the customers, the staff. Faces avoided his eyes, heads lowered. Each of you had a choice in that moment, he said evenly, and you chose silence. One of the MPs moved to the door and began taping up a red notice bearing a federal insignia. The other snapped photographs of the space from different angles. Nathan turned toward the exit. At the threshold, he paused and looked back, voice quiet but piercing. My father taught me that real leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about protection. You look out for the ones who can't fight for themselves. Today, not one of you did. Outside, the wind had died down. Franklin stood near the Black Hawk helicopter, watching as the diner doors closed behind his son. He didn't say anything at first, just shook his head slightly, as if chastising a stubborn boy who always went too far for the right reasons. You didn't have to do all that, he said softly. Nathan removed his service cap and dropped to one knee, just for a second. You taught me how to stand up, Dad, he murmured. Today was just my turn. The words hung in the air like a quiet salute, no applause following them, no banners raised. Behind the two men, the small town lay motionless. No fanfare, no breaking news, only the silent, shared understanding between a soldier and the man who had once molded him. They stepped onto the helicopter side by side, a father and son ascending into a sky that could no longer pretend Franklin Ward didn't matter. It didn't take long for the rest of the world to catch up. By the time Colonel Nathan Ward and his father were airborne, the moment was already moving faster than they were. Someone, just a teenager, slouched in the back booth of the diner with a phone barely raised above the ketchup bottle, had managed to record nearly the entire exchange. From the moment Nathan entered the diner to the final resonant words he left behind, the camera caught it all. And when Nathan spoke, when he said, you weren't supposed to know who he was, you were supposed to treat every human being with dignity, it struck something raw, something buried deep in the collective conscience of a nation that had grown far too comfortable with forgetting. Within 6 hours, the video had surged past 5 million views. Within a day, it had exploded into the national conversation. CNN ran a bold headline: The quiet man who trained our strongest, Franklin Ward, 83, in the diner that forgot honor. Fox News followed with a primetime expose titled, Service Forgotten: Why We Still Owe Our Veterans. ABC produced an in-depth feature segment called The Teacher Behind the Leaders, Who's Teaching Us Now? In all of them, the same clip repeated, Franklin's medals spilling onto the floor like a forgotten legacy. Again and again, the image rolled as anchors, veterans, sociologists, and ethicists picked apart the scene, not just as a military moment, but as a mirror held up to everyday America. And the people responded. Comments poured in by the tens of thousands, reflections from every corner of the country. That could have been my dad. This is how we treat our heroes? We don't deserve them. I served under a man trained by Franklin Ward. His fingerprints are on every good decision we made. The hashtag wave came next. #Franklin Ward, #silent valor, #respect. The elder, this is leadership. In classrooms across the country, students brought it into their civics lessons. High schoolers debated dignity and honor as if the words had weight again. In a fifth-grade classroom in Ohio, the children collected handwritten letters and mailed them in a leather-bound album. One letter, written in careful print, read, "Dear Mr. Ward, thank you for teaching your son how to stand up. When I grow up, I want to be like both of you." Mia, age 10. In Colorado, at a respected military academy, instructors replayed Nathan's words during leadership training. Cadets were reminded, honor isn't just for ceremonies. It's how you treat the quietest person in the room. But perhaps the most surprising reaction didn't come from military institutions, politicians, or networks. It came from ordinary people, citizens who had never worn a uniform, but suddenly saw in Franklin Ward a piece of something they'd forgotten in themselves. James Cooper, a marketing executive who had been seated just a few tables away during the incident, wrote a heartfelt op-ed in his local paper. "I was too wrapped up in my emails to notice what was happening right in front of me. I watched a man fall, someone who had shaped warriors, and I didn't get up. That silence will stay with me. I'm part of the problem, but I intend to be part of the change." Even Troy, the server whose harsh words had triggered the storm, released a public statement through his lawyer. "I made a terrible mistake. I judged someone by his wallet, not his worth. I deeply regret my actions." But Franklin Ward never asked for apologies. He didn't seek restitution, nor did he look for revenge. When a local journalist asked him if he wanted justice, his response was quiet, resolute. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about showing people a better way forward. He declined every interview. Back in Georgia, where the news cycle moved on but memories lingered, Franklin's life returned to its steady, humble rhythm. He still raised the flag. At dawn, Franklin Ward still made his way to the Veterans Center every Thursday. His steps had slowed with age, but his resolve hadn't wavered. He still showed up, still listened more than he spoke, the same quiet presence he had always been. But something inside those familiar walls had shifted. Where once there were bare, dimly lit panels and the smell of old varnish, now the space breathed with life and memory. The walls had become a gallery, photos sent from across the country, mailed in by soldiers. Some had once trained under Franklin himself. Others had learned from men shaped by his methods. Each photo bore a message scrawled on the back in various hands, some shaky, some bold. "Your standards built my backbone. You never met me, but your lessons did. Thank you for making better men." Then one morning, Franklin opened his door to find the town's mayor standing there, flanked by a small group of local officials. Their demeanor was solemn, respectful. They didn't come with a camera crew or fanfare. Just a quiet announcement. The high school auditorium would be renamed in his honor. Franklin Ward Hall. Franklin, taken aback, tried to refuse twice, his modesty intact even in the face of gratitude. But after a pause, eyes softened by memory, he said simply, "If it inspires just one young person to treat the next man with dignity, go ahead." And they did. Elsewhere, Colonel Nathan Ward, Franklin's son, stayed true to his nature, quiet in public, restrained, composed. Even as news spread, he didn't offer interviews or attend ceremonies. Only when pressed by a national media outlet did he release a single written statement. It read, "The uniform comes off eventually, but the values shouldn't. My father didn't raise a soldier. He raised a man who knew when to act." The message caught fire, not for its eloquence or drama, but for its unmistakable truth. It struck a nerve. From the ashes of a humiliating moment in a roadside diner, a new conversation rose. It wasn't just about veterans anymore. It became something deeper, a national reflection on decency, humility, and how easily we forget what dignity looks like until someone reminds us. It didn't begin with a camera, or a movement, or a press release. It began with an old man in a threadbare coat, doing what was right when no one was supposed to be watching. 6 months had passed since the helicopter had landed in front of that diner. The dust had long since settled, but the memory had not. The diner itself never reopened. Its sign, once bright with neon promise, remained faded and untouched. Locals still glanced its way when they drove past. Not out of guilt, out of reverence. It had become a quiet monument, not of shame but of change. People didn't speak of it often anymore, but its ripple lived on. In the little pauses before speaking harshly, in the thoughtful silence before judgment, in the simple decency exchanged between strangers when no one else was there to witness it. Franklin Ward never once brought up the incident, not to his friends at the Veterans Center, not to his neighbors, not even to his son. He didn't need to. The world had already said everything for him, Mom. At the center, something extraordinary had taken root. Volunteers, once sparse and sporadic, now came in waves. First they doubled, then tripled. Young men and women from neighboring towns signed up not because someone asked, but because something inside them stirred. They served hot meals, ran errands, read letters aloud, or just sat quietly beside a veteran and listened. The chairs that had once cradled quiet grief now rang with conversation and laughter. Not because pain had vanished, but because one man's silent strength had reminded everyone that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, and neither should respect. Among the newest volunteers was Amy, the young waitress who had been there, who had witnessed every second of the event that changed everything. She hadn't been able to forget. Something in her had shifted. One day she arrived wearing a crisp blouse and slacks, her hair pinned back, her expression serious and bright. In her hand, she carried a folded paper stamped with a government seal. Her fingers shook as she passed it to Franklin. "I've been accepted," she said, voice wavering slightly. "Officer candidate school. I ship out in 2 weeks." Franklin paused, still bent over a bin of winter coats. Slowly he straightened, studying her face. What he saw there was familiar, a blend of fear and courage, and he understood it at once. "Why now, he asked, his voice low and kind. She held his gaze and answered with quiet conviction. "Because I saw what leadership looks like, and I wanted to be someone who lives that way." Franklin didn't flinch when it counted. He didn't shout, didn't scold, didn't seek pity or applause. He simply looked you in the eye and stood his ground, steady, calm, and unwavering. When she was ready to leave for training, he handed Amy a small wooden box. It was aged and scuffed, its edges smoothed down by time and use. Inside was his old brass field compass, tarnished but still precise, and a folded note in his hand. "If ever you lose your way, don't ask where you are. Ask who you are." Troy, the young waiter who had publicly humiliated Franklin, was given a second chance, though not in the way he'd wanted. Rather than facing formal charges, the judge approved an alternative resolution. 6 months of mandatory community service at the local Veterans Center, working under Franklin's supervision. It was a sentence some might have seen as a punishment, but Franklin never treated it that way. At first, Troy showed up with a heavy silence, dragging guilt behind him like a shadow. His presence brought discomfort to some of the older veterans, a reminder of the dignity once insulted. But Franklin didn't single him out. No stern lectures, no sharp tone, no cold shoulders. He treated Troy exactly like any new volunteer, with quiet expectations and space to grow, and little by little something shifted. The change wasn't loud or immediate, but it was real. Troy started listening. One quiet afternoon, he sat for over an hour beside a triple amputee, saying almost nothing, just listening as the man shared memories of Afghanistan. Another day, when the heating system broke, Troy fixed it on his own without being asked. No announcement, no credit, just done. Another evening, long after most had gone home, he stayed behind and repainted the hallway walls, covering up the years of wear and tear. No one noticed, except Franklin. Near the end of his service, during cleanup one evening, Troy approached Franklin. His hands fidgeted with a rag, and he stared at the floor. "You could have ruined me," he said, voice quiet. "But you didn't. Why?" Franklin, folding a blanket and placing it on the shelf, didn't even pause. "Because sometimes," he replied, "a second chance means more than a first impression." Troy nodded slowly. "You taught me that," he said, his voice thick with something he wasn't used to, respect. "And you never even raised your voice." 1 year after the diner incident, the town gathered in front of the high school auditorium. It had been newly renamed Franklin Ward Hall. The mayor stood on stage to deliver the dedication speech, but Franklin had only shown up because Nathan had insisted on driving him there himself, making sure he couldn't sneak out the back like he probably would have preferred. When presented with the plaque, Franklin kept it simple. He wasn't one for speeches. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about remembering who we're supposed to be every day, to strangers, to veterans, to each other." Back in his home, a single letter now hung framed on his wall. He had once kept it folded away in a drawer for years. It was from Nathan, written nearly 20 years earlier. "Whenever I faced a hard choice overseas, I'd ask myself, what would Dad do?" That question never failed me. Directly across from it hung a hand-carved wooden sign. Amy had made it before shipping off to basic. The letters were uneven but proud. "Character isn't what you preach, it's what you protect." Franklin Ward never sought attention. He never led marches or shouted in protest. He never asked for the spotlight. He just stood, quietly, firmly, and with purpose. And in doing so, he reminded not just a town, but eventually an entire nation, that true strength doesn't swagger. It doesn't threaten or boast. It teaches by example, not by volume. Sometimes the old veteran sitting quietly in the corner, the one you barely notice, turns out to be the one holding up the spine of the entire community. He becomes the moral compass others didn't even know they were missing. In Franklin's silent dignity, we saw something precious, something that feels increasingly rare today. Not noise, not outrage, not division, but principle. He never sought revenge. He never asked to be seen. He just stood. And because he did, others remembered how to stand too. This story was never just about one veteran or one moment in a diner. It's about something deeper, a quiet, persistent memory of a people who built and defended the freedoms we often take for granted. In a world too quick to judge based on what someone wears, earns, or owns, Franklin's story reminds us, the person you overlook just might be the one who once carried the weight of your freedom. Have you ever watched someone walk into a room and instantly be judged, not for what they did, but for how they looked, how they dressed, or the burdens they carried that no one else could see? Maybe it was a stranger, or maybe it was someone close to you. Maybe it was a moment that passed too quickly. Or maybe it still lingers, because you wish you'd spoken up. Think about the man who raised you, or the one raising your children now. Think about the kind of strength that doesn't shout, but endures. The kind that doesn't demand respect, but earns it through quiet sacrifice. What does dignity look like in your world? Is it a proud back held straight despite the weight of 1,000 disappointments? Is it choosing kindness when bitterness would be easier? When was the last time you stood up? Not because you had something to gain, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Maybe it was a small gesture, a hand on a shoulder, a seat given up, a voice raised even when it trembled. Or maybe you're still carrying the silence of the moment you didn't act, wondering what might have changed if you had. These stories matter. Yours does. Because they remind us that decency isn't outdated, it's essential. That character isn't about appearances, but choices. And that sometimes it's the ones who say the least who leave behind the most powerful legacy. So if you've ever witnessed injustice or found yourself at the edge of courage, we want to hear from you. Share your story. It might be exactly what someone else needs to find their voice. It might help someone else stand taller next time. Thank you for staying with us. If this message touched something in you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and pass it on to someone who still believes in doing what's right, even when no one's watching. Until next time, look out for one another, and never, ever underestimate the strength of someone walking alone, quietly carrying the weight of what matters most.